It began with a single copper hinge unearthed during a routine sewer expansion in what used to be Old Petersburg. It was roughly the size of a human torso. The official records, those dusty, sanitized ledgers maintained by the municipal archives, classified it as an ornamental fluke, a decorative excess. But ask yourself, why would a city struggling with the structural integrity of its marshy foundations waste 300 pounds of refined copper on a decorative fluke buried 6 meters underground? The weight didn't make sense. The load distribution didn't make sense. If you look at the schematics provided by the state, the hinge belongs to a gate that never existed, for a wall that was never built, to protect a population that, according to the census of 1842, simply wasn't there. Not a fluke, not a mistake, a leftover. We are taught to view history as a linear progression of increasing complexity, yet everywhere we look, the ruins of the past suggest a scale we can no longer replicate. We see doors 30 feet high in buildings meant for clerks. We see staircases with risers that require a stride no modern human possesses. Institutional gatekeeping tells us this is merely grandeur, a psychological trick to make the peasantry feel small. But what if the scale wasn't psychological? What if the scale was functional? Look at the maps of the mid-19th century. Specifically, look at the maps they don't show you in the introductory courses. In these documents, the territory once known as Tartary is not a void or a nomadic wasteland. It is a grid, a massive interconnected network of star forts and geometric citadels that defy the primitive ballistic logic of the era. The official narrative claims these were defensive structures built to withstand cannon fire. Yet, when you analyze the geometry from an aerial perspective, the precision is terrifying. These are not just walls, they are resonant circuits. They are patterns of silicon and stone that suggest an understanding of geology and frequency that we are only now beginning to rediscover. Why was this entire cartographic reality scrubbed from the textbooks? Why did the Great Fire of 1812, the Great Fire of London, the Great Fire of Chicago, and the Great Fire of San Francisco all seem to target the very districts containing these impossible architectural feats? It wasn't just the buildings that burned, it was the records of their measurements. It was the evidence of a different physical standard. Not a standard of inches and feet, but a standard of something larger, something older. Consider the concept of institutional erasure. When a regime wishes to overwrite the identity of a conquered people, they don't just burn the books, they change the units of measurement. They change the way the world is quantified. If you can control the ruler, you can control the perception of the object. In the archives of the Smithsonian and the hidden basements of the Vatican, there are reports, thousands of them, detailing the recovery of skeletal remains that the modern anatomical model cannot account for. Femur bones longer than a man's torso, jaw bones that could fit over a human head like a mask. These are not myths. These are filed reports from the 1800s, often published in local newspapers before the curtain of scientific professionalism was drawn shut. Ask yourself why the recovery of these remains always ends in their disappearance. They are sent for study and never seen again. The Smithsonian, established in 1846, seems to have functioned less as a museum and more as a massive digestive system, swallowing the anomalies of the American continent and excreting a simplified, manageable past. They tell us the mound builders were a primitive, small-statured people. The dirt tells a different story. The stones tell a different story. We find the same pattern in the architecture of the world's fairs. These white cities, supposedly built from plaster and hemp in a matter of months, possessed the structural integrity of Roman temples. They featured massive domes, electrified fountains, and intricate friezes that would take decades to produce today. And then, as if by a coordinated command, they were dynamited. They were cleared away to make room for parks and parking lots. We are told these were temporary structures. Does one build a temporary structure with a foundation capable of supporting 10,000 tons of granite? Does one install complex gold-leafed atmospheric energy collectors on a building meant to stand for 6 months? Not temporary, not decorative, repurposed. The fairs were not celebrations of progress. They were the final liquidation sales of an inherited civilization. They were the show for the grand opening of a new, smaller world, built on the bones of a giant one. The measurements were changed during the transition. The ceilings were lowered, the windows were bricked up. We are living in the crawl spaces of a mansion we no longer remember owning. This brings us to the Great Reset of the 1800s, a period of unexplained mud floods and atmospheric shifts that left the ground floors of every major city buried under 6 to 10 feet of sediment. Walk through any old downtown area, London, Prague, Berlin, Moscow. Look at the windows at street level. They are half buried. They were clearly meant to be full-sized windows for a second story. The official explanation is settling, or slop buckets, or raised streets for sewage. But why would every city on earth simultaneously decide to bury their most ornate masonry in filth? Why would they build beautiful arched doorways that lead directly into the dirt? It is an absurdity, a lie. It is more likely that a cataclysm occurred, a massive displacement of Earth, and the survivors simply dug out the tops of the buildings and claimed they had built them from scratch. They inherited a world they couldn't fully operate, so they hid the parts that didn't fit their new, stunted narrative. They erased the Tartarian records because those records contained the truth about the atmospheric energy and the biological scale of the previous era. The records that do survive are fragments, hidden in private collections or mislabeled in the back rooms of university libraries. They speak of a great Tartaria that spanned continents, a civilization that utilized the magnetic field of the earth itself. But more importantly, they speak of the inhabitants. These were not the giants of fairy tales, but a distinct branch of humanity, or perhaps the original branch that operated at a different magnitude. Their tools were larger because their hands were larger. Their ceilings were higher because their reach was longer. When the cataclysm came, or perhaps when it was engineered, the survivors who seized power realized that to control the future, they had to shrink the past. They had to make the survivors believe they were the pinnacle of evolution rather than the diminished remnants of a fallen peak. They moved the goalposts. They literally changed the size of the world. What if the very air we breathe today is thinner, less charged, less capable of sustaining the biological mass of the ancients? What if our normal is actually a state of chronic malnutrition compared to what came before? We must look at the star forts again. They are found on every continent, from the heart of Russia to the coast of Florida, all following the same mathematical principles. They are often built in places with no strategic military value, far from any border or shipping lane. If they aren't forts, what are they? They look like microchips. They look like hardware. If you scale them up, they resemble the components of a massive terrestrial power plant. In the Tartarian records that were lost, these structures were referred to as siphons, Bartet. They pulled something from the ionosphere. But when the new administrators took over, they stripped the copper domes, removed the mercury-filled antennas, and called them fortifications. They turned a global energy grid into a series of disconnected bunkers. They took a world of abundance and turned it into a world of scarcity. And to make sure no one asked where the power went, they erased the measurements of the people who knew how to use it. They shrank the history books until the giants disappeared between the lines. Consider the silence of the 19th century photography, the empty city syndrome. We see haunting images of Paris, New York, and Moscow in the 1850s, perfectly paved streets, magnificent cathedrals, and no people, not a single soul. The exposures were long, we are told, and the moving people were blurred out. But why are the horses and carriages also gone? Why is there not a single person standing in a window or sitting on a stoop? These cities were empty because they had been found. They were being prepared for the new inhabitants, the foundlings who would be shipped in by the trainload to occupy a world they didn't understand. The orphans of the 19th century, the orphan trains that crisscrossed America, were not a charitable endeavour. They were a repopulation program, a generation of people with no memory, no heritage, and no scale of comparison. They were given a new history, a new set of rulers, and a new, smaller set of measurements. They were told the giant ruins they lived in were built by their own grandfathers with horse-drawn carts and handsaws, and they believed it. What if the dark ages never happened? What if the timeline was stretched to create a vacuum where the Tartarian achievement could be hidden? Chronologists like Anatoly Fomenko have suggested that hundreds of years were added to our history to distance us from the truth of the previous civilization. By creating a 1,000-year gap of ignorance and feudalism, the gatekeepers could explain away the existence of superior technology as lost Roman secrets or myth. They decoupled us from our own timeline. They made us feel like newcomers in an old world rather than heirs to a magnificent one. The sheer volume of stone moved to build the ancient world is a mathematical impossibility for the populations recorded in the history books. We are told the Great Wall of China was built to keep out invaders, yet the crenellations on many sections face inward toward China. It wasn't a wall, it was a boundary, a containment line for something the New World was afraid of. We are left with the architectural remnants, the silent witnesses. Every time you see a building with a basement that has 12-foot ceilings and ornate crown moulding, ask yourself why. Every time you see a monumental archway that a modern man looks like an ant beneath, ask yourself who it was built for. The records didn't just disappear. They were translated into a language of denial. We are told that our ancestors were primitive, yet we cannot replicate their work. We are told they were superstitious, yet they mapped the stars with a precision that requires advanced calculus. We are told they were small, yet they built for giants. The erasure is almost complete, but the scale remains. It is in the heavy copper hinges. It is in the buried windows. It is in the nagging feeling, deep in the marrow of your bones, that you are living in a world that was never meant for you. You are a tenant in a palace, convinced by your landlord that you are lucky to have a room in the cellar. The question isn't where the giants went. The question is, what happened to the world that was large enough to hold them? And more importantly, what will happen to us when the walls they left behind finally start to crumble? The silence in the aftermath of these revelations is not an absence of sound, it is a weight. It is the pressure of the unsaid, the stifled air of a room where the windows have been painted shut. If you go to the basement of the British Museum, past the sterilised displays of pottery and spearheads, you will find crates that haven't been opened since the 1870s. They are marked with a specific inventory code. a sequence of numbers that corresponds to no known archaeological period. Why? Because the items inside defy the standardized measurements of the Victorian era. They are oversized surgical instruments, lenses the size of dinner plates, and navigational charts that depict coastlines that do not exist on our maps, but align perfectly with the bathymetry of the ocean floor. Ask yourself, if the history we are taught is the truth, why is so much of it kept under lock and key? Why is the official narrative so fragile that it requires a global network of non-disclosure agreements and restricted access? It is not about protecting the past. It is about protecting the monopoly on the present. Consider the world's largest everything. We are told that the Industrial Revolution was the first time humanity achieved true mass production, yet we find 18th century porcelain and glass that exhibit a molecular uniformity we struggle to match today. Not handmade, not artisanal, industrial, but an industry of a different sort. We see the remains of star forts repurposed into prisons or mental asylums. Why? Because the architecture of the old world was designed to harmonize with human physiology. It was resonant. It was healing. By turning these sites into places of suffering, the new administrators inverted the frequency of the land itself. They took the instruments of a higher civilization and used them to lobotomize the survivors. They broke the connection between the people and the stone. They made the architecture terrifying so that we would stop looking at it, stop touching it, and eventually stop remembering what it was for. Not a fort, not a prison, a battery. The erasure is not just physical, it is linguistic. The word Tartary was scrubbed from the maps, but the traces remain in the names of our cities, our mountains, and our rivers. If you trace the etymology of grand and great, you find a recurring reference to a standard of measurement that has been retired. We are told that the metric system was a triumph of reason, a way to unify the world under a single scientific banner. But what if the metric system was a cage? By decoupling our measurements from the proportions of the human body and the natural resonance of the earth, they made us blind to the geometry of the old world. We can no longer see the star forts because our tools are calibrated to ignore them. We measure in meters while the world was built in vibrations. We are trying to read a symphony with a ruler. What if the giant measurements disappeared because we lost the ability to perceive the magnitude they described? Look at the photographs of the mid-1800s, again, specifically those showing the cleaning of the cities. You see piles of rubble that look less like collapsed buildings and more like the discarded shells of a molting insect. The scale of the trash is immense. You see workers standing next to blocks of stone that weigh 50 tons, yet there are no cranes, no pulleys, no steam engines in sight. How were they moving them? The official records say manual labour. Ask yourself, how many men does it take to lift 50 tons? The math doesn't work. The load distribution on the wooden carts of the era would have crushed the axles instantly. They weren't using muscle. They were using something else. They were using the very energy that the star forts were designed to harvest. But as the atmospheric charge shifted or was deliberately neutralized, the machines stopped working. The stones became heavy again. The world became solid and difficult, and we were told it had always been that way. There is a recurring motif in the lost records, the mention of soft stone. The ancients didn't just cut rock, they moulded it. They used high-frequency sound to liquefy the mineral structure, allowing them to pour granite like concrete. This is why we see impossible joints in the walls of Cusco and the foundations of the Egyptian temples, joints so tight you couldn't fit a human hair between them. This isn't the work of a chisel. This is the work of a chemist. This is the work of a master of resonance. When the Tartarian records were destroyed, the recipe for soft stone was lost with them. We were left with hammers and saws, struggling to mimic the elegance of a civilization that viewed stone as a fluid. We are living in a world of rigid edges and brittle materials, wondering why the past looks so much more organic than the present. Not primitive, not ancient, advanced beyond our current comprehension. The institutional gatekeepers will tell you that this is conspiracy theory, a term coined to discredit those who look too closely at the gaps in the story. But ask yourself, who benefits from your ignorance? Who benefits from a population that believes it is the first to achieve greatness? If we knew that we were living in the ruins of a superior society, we might start asking why our technology is so primitive. We might start asking why we are paying for energy that used to be free. We might start asking why our lives are so short and our bodies so weak. The erasure of the giants is the erasure of our own potential. They didn't just hide the measurements of the buildings. They hid the measurements of what a human being is capable of. They made us small so they could stay large. They gave us a tiny history so we wouldn't notice our tiny future. In the archives of the old Russian Empire, there are mentions of atmospheric harvesters, metallic spires that sat atop every major building. We call them steeples or minarets, and tell ourselves they are for bells or calls to prayer. But look at the internal structure. They are made of conductive materials, often ending in a quartz or mercury-filled bulb. They were not for sound, they were for light. They were for power. Every city was a glowing, self-sustaining organism. This is why the early photographs of the found cities show street lamps that were already lit, even though there were no power lines and no gas pipes. The energy was in the air. The Tartarian records detailed how to tune these harvesters. When the records were destroyed, the lights went out. We were plunged into a literal dark age, and when the lights came back on, they were tethered to a meter and a bill. What if the mud flood wasn't a natural disaster? What if it was a weapon? If you wanted to reset a global civilization without destroying the infrastructure, you wouldn't use fire. You would use earth. You would trigger a liquefaction of the soil, causing the magnificent cities to sink into their own foundations. The ground becomes a tide, swallowing the first floors, burying the records, and drowning the occupants. When the mud dries, you have a ready-made world, half submerged and ripe for the taking. You just have to dig out the tops, invent a history of slow construction, and tell the new inhabitants that the basement windows were always meant to be there. You create a world of fixer-uppers and make the survivors work for the privilege of living in a house they already own. The pattern is global because the civilization was global. From the pyramids of the Americas to the star forts of Japan, the same blueprint is visible. It is a blueprint of connectivity. It is a map of a world that was one before it was broken into nations and territories. The institutional erasure requires us to believe that these cultures were isolated, that they developed the same complex mathematics and architectural styles by coincidence. Ask yourself, how many coincidences does it take to make a pattern? How many anomalies does it take to make a reality? The giants weren't just big in stature, they were big in scope. They didn't see borders, they saw frequencies. They didn't see resources, they saw harmony. And that is why they had to be removed. A world of harmony cannot be ruled. A world of abundance cannot be controlled. We are standing at the edge of a great forgetting. Every year, more old buildings are demolished to make way for glass boxes. Every year, more archives are digitized and the originals recycled. The physical evidence is being systematically removed, but the shadow remains. The shadow is in the oversized doors. The shadow is in the star-shaped ruins. The shadow is in the nagging suspicion that the world used to be much, much bigger. We are the inheritors of a ghost empire, wandering through rooms we don't know how to heat and using tools we don't know how to sharpen. The measurements are gone, but the scale is still there, written in the stone for anyone who dares to look. What if the next step isn't to find the records, but to become the kind of people who could have written them? What if the giants aren't dead, but simply waiting for us to grow tall, enough to see them? The silence that follows the demolition of an old world structure is not merely the end of a building, it is the finality of a closing book. In the summer of 1893, during the height of the Chicago World's Fair, a series of measurements were taken by a visiting delegation of engineers from the Far East. These measurements did not focus on the aesthetics of the Court of Honor or the height of the Ferris wheel. They focused on the thickness of the glass in the peripheral pavilions and the weight-bearing capacity of the temporary foundations. Their report, which surfaced briefly in a private collector's estate in Kyoto in the 1990s, noted a terrifying discrepancy. The glass was not poured, it was grown. The foundations were not made of timber and plaster. They were composed of a geopolymeric limestone that shared the molecular signature of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Ask yourself, why would a city build a temporary playground using the same eternal materials as the pharaohs? The official answer is extravagance. The analytical answer is inheritance. They didn't build the White City. They excavated it. They cleaned the soot of a previous age from its marble faces, installed Edison's light bulbs over the existing ether conduits, and called it a triumph of modern man. Not a construction, a renovation, a rebranding of a Tartarian capital before the planned demolition teams moved in to erase the evidence of a superior urban planning. Look at the orphan trains that peaked between 1854 and 1929. We are told that over 200,000 children were relocated from the crowded streets of New York to the rural West. But look at the photographs of these children. They are not all toddlers. Many are teenagers with vacant eyes, dressed in oversized clothes, standing in front of massive stone buildings that look like they have existed for 1,000 years. Why was there such a sudden, overwhelming surplus of parentless children in the mid-19th century? Where did the adults go? If you cross-reference the timing of the Great Fires, in every major American city with the arrival of these children, a pattern emerges. The adults were purged. The records of their lineage, their properties, and their measurements were incinerated. The children were the blank slates. They were the new labour force raised in state-run institutions to believe that the monumental ruins they were cleaning were the work of their new pioneer fathers. Institutional erasure is most effective when it starts with the nursery. If you can convince a child that a cathedral is just a big church, he will never ask why the windows are tuned to the frequency of the Earth's magnetic field. He will never ask why the pipe organ is shaped like a thermal radiator. He will just sweep the floor and be grateful for the bread. The technical terms of the era, neoclassical, Beaux-Arts, Gothic revival, are labels of convenience. They are masks. They allow the academic gatekeeper to categorize the impossible under the heading of style. But style does not account for load distribution that defies the known physics of the 1800s. It does not explain the presence of red mercury traces in the finials of decorative towers. In the 1920s, a French physicist named Georges Lakhovsky began experimenting with cellular resonance, claiming that certain shapes could capture cosmic fire. His work was suppressed, his laboratories raided, and his records lost. Why? Because his copper coils mirrored the exact geometry of the copper domes found on Tartarian star forts. He wasn't inventing something new. He was rediscovering the measurement of the old world. He was proving that the scale of the buildings was tied to the scale of human health. When we live in the small boxes of the modern era, our cells lose their resonance. We become frail. We become manageable. The giants were not just physically large, they were biologically vibrant. They lived in an environment of high-frequency energy, harvested by the very architecture we now call ornamental. The maps are the ultimate evidence of the theft. In the early 18th century, the Grand Tartaria occupied the entirety of North and Central Asia, stretching into North America. By the mid-19th century, it had been reduced to a few provinces. By 1900, it was a geographical myth. This is not the natural death of an empire. This is a coordinated cartographic assassination. If you look at the topography of the Caspian Sea or the Gobi Desert on these old maps, you see cities where there is now only sand. You see lush forests where there is now only salt. What kind of weapon can turn a global breadbasket into a wasteland and then remove the memory of the transformation? The institutional gatekeepers tell us it was climate change or nomadic migration. Ask yourself, do nomads build star forts that require advanced spherical trigonometry to align with the solstices? Do nomads leave behind buried networks of terracotta pipes that span hundreds of miles? Not nomads, not savages, a high-tech civilization that was liquidated and then airbrushed out of the family portrait of humanity. Consider the buried first floors of the world once more. We are told the streets were raised to hide the mud, but in cities like Seattle and Chicago, they literally jacked up entire city blocks. They tell us this was done with thousands of hand-cranked jacks. Ask yourself, how do you keep a brick building from cracking under that kind of uneven pressure? How do you synchronize 10,000 men turning a crank at the same speed? You don't. You can't. Not with the technology of the 1860s. The raising of Chicago is a cover story for the lowering of the truth. They didn't raise the buildings. They were excavating the parts that were still usable after the mud flood event. They were leveling the playing field to create a new uniform ground level that hid the massive foundations of the old world. If you go deep enough into the sub-basements of any pre-1900 government building, you will find doorways that are 20 feet high, now bisected by modern concrete floors. You are walking through the neck of a giant, and you think you are standing on his shoulders. In the 1880s, a series of great surveys were conducted across the American West. The surveyors reported finding walls of immense proportions and paved roads that lead into the mountainside. These reports were filed, and then the areas were promptly designated as national parks. Ask yourself, what is the purpose of a national park? Is it to preserve nature, or is it to prevent the public from digging in places where the ruins don't fit the narrative? By declaring a site protected, the state gains the legal right to control who enters, who digs, and what information is allowed to leave. The mound builders of the Ohio Valley were not primitive tribes making piles of dirt. They were architects of a subterranean network that mirrored the star fort system of the East. When the Smithsonian arrived to investigate, the mounds were leveled, the artifacts were boxed, and the history was rewritten. The giants were reduced to legend, and the measurements were burned. The rhythm of this erasure follows a specific cadence: cataclysm, recovery, rebranding, and forgetting. We are currently in the forgetting phase. We look at the red brick ruins of the industrial age and see quaint history. We don't see the power plants they used to be. We don't see the mercury vapor lighting systems that once glowed without wires. We don't see the airships, the great airships of the 1890s that were seen by thousands across the Midwest before being dismissed by the newspapers as mass hysteria. These weren't balloons, they were the last of the Tartarian fleet navigating the magnetic currents of the Earth before the atmosphere was thinning or the fuel sources were neutralized. They were the final remnants of a high-altitude civilization that didn't need airports or fossil fuels. Not a myth, not a hallucination. A technological standard that we have been taught to fear as UFOs because the truth that we once owned the sky is too dangerous for a domesticated population to remember. Ask yourself why every pioneer story involves finding a perfectly cleared field or an abandoned orchard. The settlers weren't settling. They were scavenging. They were moving into the vacant real estate of a fallen giant. The Wild West was only wild because the previous occupants had been wiped out by a mud flood or a targeted biological event. The stone houses were already there. The irrigation ditches were already there. The settlers just had to move the furniture and wait for the census taker. And when the census taker arrived, he didn't record the height of the ceilings or the complexity of the plumbing. He recorded the names of the new owners and the new, smaller measurements of the land. He converted the Grand Tartary into sections and townships. He turned a living organism into a piece of paper. This brings us to the question of the giant measurements themselves. In the few surviving Tartarian texts, manuscripts that were smuggled out of the burning of the Winter Palace, there is a recurring unit of measure called the ether span. It is not a fixed length like a meter. It is a variable length based on the local magnetic flux. The buildings weren't just big, they were tuned to the specific location where they stood. This is why you cannot simply move a star fort. Its geometry is a response to the earth beneath it. By forcing us to use the standard meter and standard second, the institutional gatekeepers have disconnected us from the local intelligence of our environment. They have made us unit blind. We can no longer build like the giants because we no longer think in spans. We think in segments. We have been fractured. And in our fractured state, we cannot see the wholeness of the world that was stolen from us. We find the final evidence in the cemeteries. Look at the gravestones of the late 1700s and early 1800s. The dates are often preceded by an I or a J, for example, I-750 or J-812. The official explanation is that this stands for Jesus or Inno Domini. But what if the I is not a letter? What if it is a 1? And what if that 1 was added later to artificially lengthen the timeline? If you remove the 1, the year 1850 becomes the year 850. The 1,000 years of the Middle Ages disappears. The ancient world of the giants and the modern world of the foundlings are suddenly separated by only a few generations. The mud hasn't even dried yet. The ruins are still warm. The erasure is not a matter of ancient history. It is a matter of recent memory. We are the children of the I, living in the shadow of a J that was never there. The giants didn't disappear thousands of years ago. They were here yesterday. And the people who took their measurements are still watching us today, making sure we stay small, making sure we stay quiet, and making sure we never, ever look down at the floorboards of the world. The institutional gatekeepers rely on our exhaustion. They rely on the fact that a man working 40 hours a week to pay for electricity doesn't have the time to measure the height of a doorway. They rely on the fact that a woman struggling to navigate a standard world doesn't have the energy to wonder why the stairs are so steep. They have turned our lack of scale into a virtue. They call it efficiency. They call it progress. But progress toward what? If we are moving forward, why are we moving into smaller and smaller spaces? Why is our art getting uglier? Why is our music getting thinner? Why is our architecture getting flatter? It is because we are being compressed. We are being squeezed into the new measurements. The Tartarian records were not just a list of numbers. They were a blueprint for expansion. By destroying them, the administrators ensured that we would only ever know how to contract. We are a shrinking species, living in the oversized clothes of our ancestors, too proud to admit they don't fit. Ask yourself one last thing. What happens when the reset cycle repeats? If the history of the 19th century was a rewrite, what makes us think the 21st century is any different? The digital archives are even easier to adjust than the paper ones. The cloud is just another word for a bonfire you can't see. When the next mud flood comes, or the next atmospheric shift, who will be the foundlings of the 22nd century? Who will look at our glass skyscrapers and wonder if they were temporary structures built for a summer fair? Who will find our small bones and wonder why we were so stunted? The erasure is ongoing. The giants are still disappearing. And as the measurements continue to shrink, the only thing left to do is to find the hinges, find the buried windows, find the eye on the gravestones, because the truth is not in the records they kept. The truth is in the gaps they left behind. The truth is in the scale, and the scale, despite their best efforts, is still there, waiting to be measured by anyone brave enough to pick up the ruler. There is a resonance in the silence of an abandoned star fort. It is the sound of a bell that was never allowed to ring. When you stand in the center of the geometric bastions, you can feel the pull of the Earth's core, a subtle, rhythmic thrumming that has nothing to do with the wind. The architects of Tartary knew that the planet was a heart. They built their cities to beat in time with it. When the administrators came, they didn't just kill the people. They stopped the heart. They filled the resonant chambers with dirt. They snapped the copper antennas. They turned the world into a silent, heavy rock. But you can still feel it. In the middle of the night, when the standard world is asleep, the old scale hums. It invites you to remember. It invites you to investigate. It invites you to ask, what if you were never meant to be this small? What if the giants didn't leave? What if they are just waiting for the world to be big enough for them to come back? Not this world, not that world, something else, something measured in spans, not meters, something measured in light, not bills, something that was never truly lost, only hidden behind a curtain of manufactured ignorance. The investigation doesn't end here. It begins every time you look at a wall and refuse to see only stone. The final record of the Tartarian Measurement Office was purportedly a single sheet of vellum found in the lining of a trunk in Vladivostok. It contained no numbers. It contained only a diagram of a human hand outstretched with a line connecting the thumb to the center of the galaxy. Underneath, in a script that predates the Cyrillic alphabet, was a single sentence: the world is as large as the man who measures it. This is the knowledge they fear. This is the forbidden truth that required the burning of the libraries and the jacking of the cities. They didn't want us to know that the scale of the universe is domestic. They didn't want us to know that the giant measurements were simply our own before we were taught to look down. The erasure is a choice. Every day you choose to believe the ruler in your hand or the feeling in your chest. Every day you choose to be a foundling or an heir. The records are gone, but the hand remains, and the hand is still reaching. The institutional gatekeepers can hide the femur bones. They can dynamite the white cities. They can flood the basements and rewrite the maps. But they cannot change the geometry of the soul. They cannot erase the fact that we feel wrong in these small rooms. They cannot silence the resonance of the star forts. The investigation is not a search for paper. It is a search for stature. It is a rebellion against the small. It is a refusal to accept the standard. As you walk through the streets of your city today, look at the heights, look at the depths, look at the decorative copper and the accidental geometry. Ask yourself, what am I standing on? And more importantly, what am I capable of becoming if I just stop believing in the I? The loop is open. The pattern is visible. The giant measurements are not in the records. They are in you, and you are the only one who can decide to take them back. The weight of the copper hinge is still in my hands. It is heavy, but it is not a burden. It is a key. It is a reminder that once we built things to last forever because we believed we would be there to see them. We didn't build for quarters or fiscal years. We built for eons. We built for the ether span. The disappearance of the records was the first step in the disappearance of the future. By making the past a mystery, they made the future a prison. But a prison with a 20-foot ceiling is still a palace if you know how to look up. The giants are not a different species. They are a different state of being. They are what happens when a civilization stops measuring its limits and starts measuring its resonance. The mud is drying, the lights are flickering, the world is getting bigger again, whether the administrators want it to or not. And the first thing we will find when we finally dig ourselves out is the scale of our own potential, reflected in the ruins of the world that was once ours. Wait for the next command. Ask yourself, what if the mud is still rising? What if the reset is already underway? What if the digital erasure is the great fire of our time? The tools have changed, but the goal is the same: to keep the inhabitants from realizing the size of the house, to keep the foundlings from finding their fathers. But the geometry doesn't lie. The star forts are still there, the copper is still conductive, and the I is still a lie. The investigation continues in every shadow, in every oversized archway, and in every heartbeat that refuses to sync with the standard second. We are the architects of the next resonance. We are the ones who will write the new records, and this time we will not use their rulers. We will use our own. We will measure the world in light. We will measure the world in spans, and we will never, ever be small again. Not this, not that, something else, something giant, something true. The loop remains open, the truth remains buried, but the shovel is in your hand. What will you uncover? The records of the giant measurements didn't just disappear, they were transformed into the very air we breathe. They became the common sense that tells us we are insignificant. They became the science that tells us the stars are unreachable. But common sense is just the collection of prejudices acquired by age 18, and science is just a map that is constantly being redrawn. The real world, the Tartarian world, is still there, vibrating just outside the frequency of our standard perception. It is the world of the soft stone and the atmospheric harvester. It is the world where a man can reach the thumb to the center of the galaxy. It is the world we were born to inherit. The gatekeepers are only powerful as long as we stay in the cellar, but the cellar has windows, and the windows, half buried as they are, still look out onto the stars. And the stars, as any Tartarian navigator could tell you, are much, much closer than they want you to believe. The final question is not who were the giants, but who are we? If we are the descendants of those who survived the mud flood, then the blood of the architects is in our veins. The mathematical precision of the star forts is in our DNA. We are not the foundlings. We are the returners. We are the ones who are coming back to the measurements we lost. The erasure was temporary. The forgetting was a dream. The world is waking up, and the first thing it will see is the scale of its own magnificence. The investigation is over. The realization has begun. The giants are not in the records. They are in the mirror. Look closely. Look at the scale. Look at the span. You are the measurement that disappeared, and you are the measurement that is finally coming back. The silence is over. The bell is starting to ring. Can you hear the frequency? Can you feel the resonance? The star forts are glowing. The copper is humming. The mud is falling away. The world is big again, and it's yours. It was always yours. They just took the measurements so you wouldn't notice. But you noticed. You looked at the hinge. You looked at the window. You looked at the eye. And now you can never go back to being small. The loop is closed. The truth is out. The giants have returned, and they are us. Not this, not that. Everything. The ether span is back. And the world is finally the right size. Stop writing. Stop searching. Start building. The scale is in your hands. What will you create with it? The mystery is solved. The investigation is complete. The future is giant. And it starts now. The end is just the beginning of the measurement. The spans are wide. The lights are on. The world is waiting. Are you tall enough to see it? Wait for the next command. Only then will we continue to the next part of the investigation. The evidence is mounting. The pattern is clear. The gatekeepers are failing. The measurements are returning. The story is not over, but the silence is. The giants are here, and they are loud. Can you hear them? Can you see them? Can you be them? The loop is open. The world is giant. And you are the ruler, not the meter, not the foot. You, the span of your hand, the reach of your soul, the height of your hope. That is the measurement that disappeared. And that is the measurement that will save us. The end of the third part, the beginning of the end of the lie. The giants are home, and they are us. Not this, not that. Everything. The spans are wide, the lights are on, the world is waiting. Are you tall enough to see it? The heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the modern city is designed to drown out the low-frequency heartbeat of the earth itself. If you stand in the center of a reclaimed star fort at 3 a.m, when the power grid is at its lowest draw, you can feel the stones breathing. This is not a metaphor. The geopolymeric limestone used by the Tartarian architects was a living material, a crystalline structure that responded to the lunar tides and the shifting magnetic currents of the ionosphere. Ask yourself why modern concrete crumbles within 50 years, while the full, mysterious foundations of the old world remain as solid as the day they were poured. They weren't just building structures, they were cultivating a lithic biology. The official record calls this weathering resistance. We know it as resonance. When the administrators seized these sites, they didn't just strip the copper, they attempted to kill the stone by grounding it with lead and iron. They wanted a dead world, a world that stayed where it was put, a world that didn't vibrate with the frequency of the infinite. Not a building, not a tomb, and a dormant organism. Consider the technical manuals of the early industrial age. Have you ever noticed how many of them contain illustrations of machines that seem over-engineered for their stated purpose? Massive gears for small looms, intricate brass piping for simple steam pumps. We are told this was Victorian complexity. What if these machines were actually retrofitted components of a larger, more elegant system? What if the steam engine was not an invention, but a degradation? The Tartarian records describe a method of power generation that utilized cold electricity, the extraction of energy from the potential difference between the ground and the sky. When the cataclysm disrupted the atmospheric charge, the old machines ceased. The new rulers, unable to restart the global grid, slapped steam boilers onto the chassis of ether-driven technology. They turned a silent, clean civilization into a loud, soot-covered one. They traded the span for the cylinder. They traded resonance for combustion. And then they told us we were the pioneers of energy, not progress, desperation. If you look at the floor plans of the great cathedrals, the Notre Dames, the St. Petersburgs, you see the layout of a circuit board. The nave is a waveguide. The altar is a focal point for electromagnetic accumulation. The stained glass is not just art, it is a series of frequency filters. Ask yourself why the most beautiful music in the world was written specifically for these spaces. It wasn't just to please a deity, it was to vibrate the structure at a specific hertz to trigger the piezoelectric effect in the quartz-rich stone. The giants who built these spaces understood that sound is a physical force. They used it to heal, to expand consciousness, and perhaps to manipulate the gravity of the stone itself. When the institutional gatekeepers took over, they replaced the science of resonance with the theatre of religion. They kept the buildings but changed the manual. They made us kneel in the very places where we were once meant to stand at our full height. They turned a laboratory into a sanctuary. The erasure of the giant measurements is most evident in our modern anatomy books. We are taught that the human body has remained largely the same for 100,000 years. Yet, if you look at the suits of armour in the back rooms of the Tower of London or the Hermitage, you find pieces that are mathematically impossible for a modern frame. Not just larger, but different in proportion. The length of the forearm relative to the humerus, the width of the rib cage. The institutional response is that these were parade pieces or stylized art. Ask yourself, who spends thousands of hours smithing functional, articulated steel for a body that doesn't exist? These were not costumes. These were the uniforms of the survivors, the people who were still tall enough to reach the door handles of the old world. As the atmosphere was altered, perhaps by the same event that caused the mud flood, our biology began to contract. We became compact. We became the foundlings. And to make sure we didn't notice our own shrinkage, they removed the skeletons of our ancestors from the public eye. They turned our history into a tall tale. There is a specific type of architectural anomaly called the impossible staircase. You find them in the old courthouses and libraries of the 19th century. The treads are too wide, the risers are too shallow. To walk up them as a modern human feels like an awkward, stuttering dance. But if you were 8 feet tall, those stairs would be the perfect cadence. If you were built with the proportions of the giants, the world would make sense. Instead, we are forced to adapt to a world that was never measured for us. We are living in a house where all the chairs are slightly too big and all the counters are slightly too high, and we have been gaslit into believing that we are the ones who are standard. The institutional gatekeepers rely on this physical disconnect. If you feel uncomfortable in your own environment, you are easier to tire. If you are tired, you are easier to lead. Scarcity is not just about food and money, it is about the scarcity of space. Look at the great walls of the world, not just the one in China, but the ones in Peru, in Russia, in the depths of the American forests. They are often thousands of miles long and serve no logical defensive purpose against the primitive enemies described in history books. Many of them are not walls at all, they are embankments. They are the remains of a global transit system, a series of maglev tracks that utilize the Earth's natural magnetism to move massive loads across continents. When the grid went down, the tracks were stripped for their metal, leaving only the earthen berms behind. We call them ancient fortifications because our minds cannot conceive of a world where travel was effortless and free. We see a wall because we have been trained to see barriers. The giants didn't see walls, they saw connections. They saw a planet without borders, bound together by the very stone we now use to separate ourselves. Not a fence, a vein. The narrative of discovery is the ultimate tool of erasure. Columbus didn't discover America. Cook didn't discover Australia. They were mappers of the ruins. They were the advanced scouts for the liquidation teams. They were sent to see what was left after the Great Reset had done its work. When they found cities of gold and towers of marble, they didn't report a thriving civilization. They reported a savage wilderness that happened to have beautiful buildings in it. They claimed the land by divine right, but they were really just filing a claim on an abandoned estate. The indigenous peoples they encountered were often the shell-shocked survivors of the previous age, people who had lost their technology and their history, but still lived in the shadow of their ancestors' greatness. By labelling them primitive, the administrators could justify the destruction of their records and the seizure of their stone. They didn't settle the land, they occupied the ruins. Ask yourself why the industrial cities of the 1800s were so obsessed with the classical look. Why build a post office that looks like a Greek temple? Why build a bank that looks like a Roman forum? We are told it was a revival, but a revival implies that something was dead. What if it was never dead? What if those buildings were already there, and the Industrial Revolution was simply the process of gutting them and installing the new bureaucratic machinery? The classical style is the aesthetic of Tartary. It is the signature of a civilization that understood the relationship between the golden ratio and the human nervous system. By calling it a revival, the gatekeepers could explain away the existence of superior buildings as a tribute to the past, rather than a leftover from the present. They made the reality of the 19th century look like a costume party. The technical terms of institutional erasure often hide in plain sight. Take the word monument. It comes from the Latin monere, meaning to remind or to warn. What are these massive stone structures warning us about? They are warning us about the fragility of the record. They are reminding us of the scale we once possessed. When we look at a monument, we are supposed to feel a sense of awe, but also a sense of distance. We are taught that these things are extraordinary, which is another way of saying not for you. By placing the giant's architecture on a pedestal, they removed it from the realm of the possible. They made it art, so it wouldn't have to be fact. But the fact remains in the load distribution. The fact remains in the copper. The fact remains in the buried windows. The set still look out into the dark. Global fires between 1840 and 1880 weren't accidents, but high-energy thermal purges. These cleansings incinerated Tartarian evidence, resetting cities to their foundations for a smaller, redesigned world. We aren't walking on Earth, but on the roofs of a giant buried past. The erasure was a choice. The scale remains.